Hey, so this presentation will be on the Dust Bowl and the agricultural issues that were going on and the New Deal solution to those issues. Now, I know Mrs. Kretzer already did a big thing with you guys on the Dust Bowl specifically, so I'm only going to just touch on that, refresh your memories on that, and then move forward with the New Deal stuff. So, problems in agriculture that existed. The Great Depression caused huge disruptions for farmers. Number one was the food chain, just like we're seeing now with COVID. The demand, everything's all out of whack because the food chain, as I discussed earlier this week, is sensitive, right? Small changes or seemingly small changes can have huge ripple effects. For example, milk prices. So people are still buying milk. In fact, some people are buying more than they normally would, right? And so how is this hurting dairy farmers? Well, just one example would be like Castleton College is not open, right? They're still doing classes online, but kids aren't there in the dorms eating in the cafeteria every day. And dairy farmers or their co-ops have contracts with big consumers like that. And if any of you guys have been on the trips to Castleton and eaten in the cafeteria and seen how much chocolate milk a group of high school kids can consume in a half-hour lunch, can realize that that is a significant amount of milk that would normally be being consumed by them. Now, people are now buying more milk at home because they're at home, but the whole food chain thing is all messed up because all those contracts, all those things are already set, and it's creating a real issue. Also, restaurants aren't open, or if they are, they're selling much less than they normally are. And so a lot of cheese, like think about pizza places, how much cheese do pizza places go through in a busy weekend? And they're not doing that anymore. People are making different food choices. And that goes across not just dairy, but all sorts of other things. Wheat, as is depicted in the Dust Bowl, also fruits and vegetables. So all these things are all interconnected, and they're all being affected now, excuse me, by the epidemic, and back then by the economic crisis of the Great Depression. So how does this cause an even bigger problem? Well, what farmers would do was they would borrow money, right? We didn't make any money this year. Let's say you're a wheat farmer, you plant your wheat, you harvest your wheat, you go to sell your wheat, the price is really low, you end up in the hole for the year. That's how farmers generally operate. So you're in your hole for the year. How are you going to get through the next year? We got to borrow money and then hope next year is better. And the next year comes, and next year is just as bad or worse. Now you borrow more money, and you borrow more money. And then what's your answer? Well, I'll plant more crops. I'll plant more crops. And what you're actually doing is hurting yourself, because the more product you're putting on the market, the lower the price is going to be for that product. All right, supply and demand, if you haven't taken economics yet. So basically, if you have more of something, it is less valuable. That is a law of economics. It's called scarcity. The more scarce or more rare something is, the more valuable it tends to be. For example, diamonds, right? If you could find diamonds anywhere, they would not be so valuable. Because they are rare, it really increases their value. So this creates a vicious cycle of farmers borrowing money and then planting more crops, and then having to borrow more money the next year and getting further and further and further in the hole, and there doesn't seem to be any way out of it. Just like you'll see that a lot in a lot of things we talk about with the Great Depression, these vicious downward cycles. So the Dust Bowl, Mrs. Kretzer did a lot with you guys on this already, so just remember what we're talking about here. Talking about the southern Great Plains mostly, this area here, the Texas Panhandle, the Oklahoma Panhandle, parts of Kansas, New Mexico, Colorado. The southern Great Plains, remember, is marginal farmland, meaning it was some of the last farmland to try to be worked, to try to be farmed, because it was dry, basically a borderline desert, a grassland, a savanna land, and it can go back and forth between rainy spells and dry spells. And so when they started settling there, it had been a bit wetter, and then the weather shifted back the other way and became drier, and it was a real disaster. And so, of course, you've seen all these pictures, the big dust storms, and if you're reading Grapes of Wrath, you see the depictions of this just unbelievable man-made environmental disaster. So let's get to some of the solutions. The first one we're going to talk about here is the Farm Security Administration, the FSA, with the all the acronyms that they so loved in the New Deal. And what this plan was basically a land buying program. So if you had a good farm, if you're on good land, you had good water, they'd loan you some money, help you stay on your land. But mostly what they were doing was they were looking for farmers on really bad land, like that land out in the Dust Bowl that should have never been farmed probably in the first place, and the federal government was going to buy your land, and they're going to give you a really decent price for actually what's crap land. And the point of that was to help you out and get you out of there, because if they could buy your land, then you could pay your debts and you could move somewhere else where there was decent land, or get out of farming altogether and not be stuck there still trying to farm this awful land, tearing up the soil every spring, and then creating more dust and making this problem even worse. So they also employed people in different work. They had different employment programs to help people out in rural parts of the country. The biggest thing, which was almost entirely an afterthought, would end up being how it's remembered today, was that they employed photographers or photojournalists who were normally out of work. And they said, hey, go around, take pictures of people in these rural parts of the country so that they'll be in the big city papers, and we can promote the work we're doing here and show how valuable it is. Like I said, this was kind of an afterthought. Nobody thought much of it, but because there were so many really good photographers unemployed, they had some of the best in the country, and they were out and doing phenomenal work. This is a famous picture here. I showed you a previous image of her in a previous slideshow. This woman who was, with her kids, just destitute, basically living in a tent on the side of the road. And she was photographed by a woman named Dorothea Lange, who went on to become one of the best photojournalists in the 20th century. And she got her start sort of with the Farm Security Administration taking pictures to promote their work and to show the plight of people in rural places. Because people in big cities, they don't know what goes on in the country. It's still true today, right? People in the big cities don't realize what life is like outside of the big cities, and they don't realize what the problems are or what needs to be done. And so this program, as I say here in the note, short-term help and a long-term solution. So remember that theme in New Deal programs, they're either one or the other. Some are actually both, like this one. Next one, Agricultural Adjustment Administration. Just real quick on this, because it'll get thrown out by the Supreme Court. There were actually several New Deal programs that got thrown out by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said that they were unconstitutional laws. They went too far. They violated the Constitution and what the role of the government is outlined in the Constitution. And this one was a controversial one because it was basically trying to give the government the power to set prices. And so, nope, milk is going to cost $5 a gallon. That's what consumers are going to pay. That's what farmers are going to get. And we're going to say how many gallons of milk you're going to produce, how many bushels of wheat you're going to farm, or corn, or carrots, or apples, or oranges, or whatever you're growing. The government was going to set a price, and they were going to set production levels. And this would have put the government, and it did, sort of, for a couple of years, trying to anyways, put the government in charge of all agricultural markets. This is something that was done in like communist countries, so there's a huge uproar about this as being a huge overstep by the federal government and something they should not be doing. It had some farmers liked it because it was going to give them short-term relief, but people saw this as a dangerous overstep by the government into the economy in a way that was counter to free markets and all that. So it did provide, I put a note there, it did provide short-term relief in the few years that it was around in helping farmers, at least for a couple of years, get what was thought to be a more fair price. What will eventually, though, end the crisis of all these farms, not just the Dust Bowl, because that's the separate environmental catastrophe as well, but just the economic problem, was World War II. And wars create enormous demands for all sorts of things, food being one of them. And World War II will end the Great Depression, and it also end the crisis for farmers as well. So the Drought Relief Service, this is the last program we'll look at here. This one was specific to the Dust Bowl, and essentially what they were doing was to help cattle farmers. And what they were doing was they were buying their sick and starving cows for prices that you would not pay for a sick or starving cow. And then they would take these cattle and they would take them somewhere out of the Dust Bowl and try to fatten them back up so that they could be sold and then given to needy families. It wasn't the best meat, but it was meat, right? So that did two things. One, it gave money into the pockets of poor farmers who had these cows that were sick and starving, that nobody was going to buy, that were choking and dying of dust. And it also then created cheap food or even giveaway food by the government to poor families elsewhere in the country. So it was a short-term relief program to try to alleviate what was a terrible situation in the Dust Bowl, specific to cattle ranchers, but there's other programs as well. I'm not going to get into all of them. I'm just giving you these examples to show the scope of the problem in agriculture and then also some of the solutions. So to connect to now, as I've mentioned before, there are big issues looming in all of our economic areas, but in agriculture especially, because the food chain has been so disrupted. Things are kind of out of sorts everywhere, and like we've talked about, it's all very sensitive. So we have farmers dumping milk even though people don't have enough food. You have food rotting in fields because there's no workers to harvest it because people are sick. And then you also have people lining up around the block at food banks because they're all laid off and they need help. So the government has put forward, just like with all these other economic stimulus packages, there is some relief going direct payments to farmers and in other sorts of relief programs. Remember, that's not specifically related to the New Deal, but that precedent, that idea was set by the New Deal. This idea that the federal government will step in crisis situations and actually give money to farmers or in other ways assist farmers economically during hard times. Prior to the New Deal and the Great Depression, that never happened. And as I outlined before, it was actually really controversial. And some of the things they did were actually thrown out by the Supreme Court as going way too far. So that's it for agriculture. And that's it for these 3 mini lessons this week on the New Deal. Make sure you go in to that Google Doc I shared at the beginning of the week, and you're putting in articles, but you're also putting in summaries and a brief connection to today and then, but a connection between now and then, meaning between what's going on today and what happened during the Great Depression and the New Deal to our crisis today. Hopefully that makes sense and you're clear on that. Email me your questions if you have any.